This is not terror under the Imperium, this is mankind after surviving the terrors of old night, where psyches wake and control others or become possessed by demonic beings. Gene looms once used by the men of gold to sculpt mankind now are used to unleash imprisoned terrors, and the advanced science of the golden age of technology now in the hands of dictators and tyrants. Think Thundar the Barbarian combined with Mad Max. One of the first foes the Emperor sought to vanquish in his quest to unite terror is the Mand-Sen Confederacy of States. The states had banded together during the worst years of anarchy. In those days, the weather satellites were all destroyed, and the winters had become punishing. Some form of association was required to avoid depopulation and death, just as in other areas of the globe, where the structures of civilization had degraded beyond recall. The Emperor's forces faced daily storms that would freeze equipment, and fires had to be lit under the transports he had so they could be used. This was in the early years of active expansion. The Emperor's plans had been in progress for decades by then, but he had not openly showed his hand in many areas. His stated territorial holdings were modest, enough to guarantee access to the materials needed and to impose a cordon around sites where research needed to be protected. Only when they were fully secured and his forces mustered in numbers could the Big E advance, without the stealth employed so far. Mand-Sen had been targeted by the Emperor, as it was full of abominations. He had been there in the past and wanted to eradicate the practices he had seen, yet he wanted the territory, but also to remove the taint of sorcery from terror. Sen represented that. It was a kingdom of witches at the roof of the world. A realm closer to a nightmare would be hard to imagine. It combined all that was worst about the Darkened Age. There was no law, no regulation of the powerful, no true science, a willful indulgence of excess and ignorance. They had retained scraps of knowledge and put them to foul uses, giving them a veneer of military might. But it was fragile and was already beginning to come apart, even as the Emperor's forces marched on the site. Mand-Sen was a place where some of the first major deployments were made of the Legione Astartes, along with what would become the Imperial Guard. The Emperor chose the Iron Lords, who became known later as the Iron Warriors. Even then, they were specialists in siegecraft. They had impressed the Emperor with how prepared they were, above the other legions, who at that time had not yet reached full battle readiness. The Imperial Guard was still being organised into divisions by climatic zone, for the dangers of the planet's weather were a major impediment to true global conquest, and the Emperor was able to call on cold weather specialists. The majority of the forces taken were equipped with suitable armour and had access to modified weapons. This wasn't a luxury, this was a necessity. Conditions were such that a human exposed to the elements without technological aid or other prescribed protective methods died within hours. There was also the Emperor's elite, the Legio Custodes, with them. Mand-Sen was a place of trial for the Thunder Warriors. The Emperor wanted to see if they could be as lethal en masse as they had already been in their smaller formations. Initially, the fighting divisions had been imagined as somewhat smaller than they eventually became, and thus the ranks were organised on orthodox regimental lines. The Primarch was equivalent to the Captain General rank in broad terms, responsible for the discipline and conduct of the entire Legio. The Primarch was not physically different to any of his troops, but had distinguished himself in combat and leadership, and was appointed directly by the Emperor. The Primarchs and their command groups naturally were given the best equipment they had. There were 20 of them in conception, one for each planned legio, although by that stage not all had been given the title. We have a name for the fourth, Ushatan. The enemy they faced was called the Priest King. It was a name he had given himself, one which was perfectly appropriate. His followers were fanatical, deranged by both combat narcotics and the delusions he fed them. They had laid hands on technology from the Forgotten Age and had learned or been shown how to use it. The Emperor's forces were fighting men stitched together into mockeries of the human form. Some were encased in machines and goaded into war with pain amplifiers. Most they encountered, to one degree or another, had been shaped into new forms. swapping their dignity for a feral kind of strength. The perimeter cities were conquered relatively quickly, for the taint of the Priest King was lightest there, and the heartlands of the Confederacy had always been upland, up in the high peaks where the skies flew with shards of wind-blown ice. The Emperor's forces secured a beachhead on the southwestern lowlands and flew in heavy landers to anchor their supply routes north. They operated far from home, but had familiar advantages: technology, confidence, energy. After only a month, they were planning incursions further in. Due to the terrain, unenhanced warriors suffered high attrition rates, something that was hard to minimise. As they advanced north, many of them lost their minds. There were voices in the wind, and the cold was crushing. Those who died would be encountered again, ghosts in the gales, and it preyed on the nerves of the Emperor's line troopers. The Emperor would not have been able to continue had he only been able to draw on their service. This underscored the necessity of the gene-crafted detachments. The Thunder Warriors, we are told, were vital. To quote, "Terror could not have been conquered without them. We had fallen too far and let too many monsters use. They were the weapons that allowed us to advance into that ice-locked night." It was a hard fight even with the future master of mankind there. Every citadel was contested. Every offensive was met by a counter-offensive. The enemy knew the conditions. They knew the pattern of the landscape. They had nowhere to withdraw to, so they were desperate. With their backs at the wall, they fought harder. More than 7,000 gene-crafted shock troops died in the final assault. If you had been able to see them, oh how the Thunder Warriors fought, how committed they were, and how unrestrained in slaughter, you would appreciate the nature of what we faced there. Weaknesses displayed in Nordic had been addressed. All the armour used was now of ceramic and metallurgical alloys, rather than the steel plate and hardened leather worn before. Their blades are equipped with energy fields, and the bolt gun had replaced the old carbine and las rifles. At Mand-Sen, the levels of technology were roughly comparable. What set the Emperor's forces apart was their belief. The Priest King had been hollowed out. His rantings were transparent, even to those who he had led into damnation. But the Emperor believed in his goals, and that set his forces apart from other techno-barbarians. But the Emperor's forces could feel a sickness. A Custodes comments on this. "We could all taste it. I have encountered similar sensations since, when fighting other enemies of allied origin. But then it was new to me. It generated little but disgust in me and my brothers. For the Thunder Warriors under Ushatan, it seemed to have a different effect. They thrived on it, at least for a time. They had, I surmised, the capacity to magnify whatever foulness they faced. That ferocity was useful, but it had weaknesses. The walls around the final stronghold had been constructed in the mountains. The fortifications were set high and were well defended, and they had prepared for us over many years. It was lit from behind by a greenish light, and its black walls gleamed. There was an art to its construction, but a twisted one. Every angle of its immense defences seemed to embody pain, in one form or another. Set alongside the physical challenges, there was also the presence of other obstacles. The Custodes see that it might have been wiser to slow the pace of the assault, to limit our eventual casualties. But by then the Thunder Warriors were caught in a cycle of aggression. Death meant nothing to them. For a time it seemed that orders meant nothing to them either. They were elemental in their violence. The snow was piled up around the walls in drifts 10 metres deep. Its high battlements were lined with flame weapons. When the Emperor's forces assaulted and brought up their heavy guns, they created a flood of meltwater. They advanced through torrents, a grey sea of filth that found its way inside armoured seals. The tanks stalled and the electrical relays burst. They were reduced to infantry engagements faster than anticipated, and still the walls were intact. Ushatan made the first breakthrough, and there was great slaughter once he was inside. The forces of the Big E find not all the Priest King's people were corrupted. Some were slaves, and others might still have been salvaged for productive employment within the Imperium. In that, though, the Thunder Warriors demonstrated their greatest weakness. Once loosed, they were hard to control. They broke through the inner chambers like a tide, slaughtering all they encountered. They demonstrated then the sheer power of the gene-crafted soldier. The custodians after the battle spoke to Ushitan. After the citadel had finally been taken, its roofs broken and its walls pounded into rubble, it was by then far into the following night. An entire cycle had passed in fighting, and we had barely looked up to notice it. I remember how his armour was, covered in already freezing blood. Ushitan's helm was gone, and his arm was broken. A fresh storm had descended, and the battlefields were buffeted with new snow, covering up the tracks of grey slush we had exposed. Ushitan laughed when we met him. He had a vivid light in his eyes. I thought he looked like the ghost of all murders. What did he say? Someone asked. He told me that he understood, for the first time, the reason he had been made. He told me that I would never feel the same way, and that he pitied me for that. And now, the second excerpt, covering this battle, focused more on the Emperor and the aftermath. The future Emperor was there at Mand-Sen. In the hours before, the Thunder Warriors met the Priest King's ravening hordes, armed in architect and anachronism, his armour as much baked leather and bronze as ceramite. He stood upon a high rock as the rising sun turned the eagles on his armour to virgin gold. His army stood to the south, occupying the low ground. The march to the enemy would be uphill, moving to ascend the rocky inclines, in whatever formation they could hold. To the north were the enemy, a horde of branded zealots and dirty wildlanders on the plateaus of their last mountain fastness, cladding motorised plate armour and cloaked in poorly cloned furs to brace against the cold. Lumbering brutes fleshed out their numbers, more evidence of gene forging gone awry with witchery instead of vision. They would bleed. At last, with the fall of Mand-Sen, Nordic would be brought to heel. The Emperor had looked down upon the armoured ranks closest to him, crudely armoured warriors in patched and remade suits of damaged ceramite. The campaign had been a long one, far more gruelling than predicted. His forces at the final battle were outnumbered by 7-1, though such numbers would mean nothing come the dawn. The enemy's high walls meant equally little, and the treacherous ascent to lay siege meant the least of all. The Emperor's army would sustain casualties, as every army always did, but sacrifice was bred into their bones. Victory would be theirs by the day's end. The lives beneath his banner were there to be spent in the purchase of peace. The warriors closest to the Emperor, a mere 30 souls, with Sagittarius among them, wore layered precious Aramid gold, reflecting the warlord's own war gear. In the years to follow, their trappings would become cloaked in red and bulked by additional plating, but as they stood at Mand-Sen, they wore half-suits of sacred gold, and the men themselves were a jewel at the army's vanguard, guarding their master. Their war banner was the eagle's head of their royal lord, crossed by 4 bolts of lightning. Beyond the custodians were the ranks of the proto-legionaries in their grim, battered plate. But not yet, not today. Not in the morning of Mand-Sen. Here they would lose 7,581 warriors against the defiant tides of Mand-Sen's last defenders. He recalled how the Emperor ran a gloved hand through his wind-claimed hair, pulling it back from his dusky features. Wind had battered the crests atop the Thunder Warriors' helms. Sagittarius, the Emperor had said in a voice that carried above the drone of armour. Sagittarius, his helm adorned with a rearing eagle, turned to regard his liege and said, "My king?" The Emperor responded, "It is time. Your spear, please." Sagittarius offered it without hesitation, raising his spear for the warlord's reaching hand. The Emperor took the weapon, holding it fast in one gloved fist halfway along the haft, and lifting it high. He held it horizontally, ordering his men to hold position, as officers in the Bronze Epoch and the Iron Era of Old Earth had done in the centuries before, radio-oracle systems and Vox networks that would follow. Sagittarius felt the army shift, their focus tightening as they turned their attention to the Emperor, watching, waiting. There was no speech, for the army had its orders set in stone the night before. There was no curse or oaths, for those had already been given, and made before the horde assembled. The Emperor said nothing at all. He signalled the advance, punching the horizontal spear 3 times towards the lightning sky, and there he remained as the regiments of the Thunder Legion shook the earth beneath their marching boots, advancing up into the foothills. His honour guard of 30 custodians waited with him, as did a host of banner bearers, aides, runners, attendants and advisors, each with their own stewards and guardians. Sagittarius watched the disorganised tide of soldiers make their way up the inclines. Their chaotic advance was as far from the order of the Legiones Astartes as could be imagined, nor could they rely on the same arsenal of biological enhancements implanted within the true Space Marines. These hordes were forced to crush the techno-savages of the Unification Wars, no doubt, but against the alien breeds of the galaxy, the Thunder Warriors would have been annihilated. The Emperor was paying scant heed to the battle's opening, his patient gaze resting on the higher peaks. From here, he could see the killing machines would soon rise. He handed the spear back to Sagittarius, who took it with due reverence. The Emperor checked the ornate bolter at his hip, one of the very first bolt guns, a progenitor for its kind, not a relic discovered from the Dark Age of tech, but an invention of the Emperor's own design. The Mand-Sen Confederacy was Nordic-based, and served dark gods, and so was a ripe target for the Emperor's mission. The Emperor walked, cloaked against the cold. He held a sword dull in deactivation. Battle was around him. From the churned earth of shell craters to the remains of warriors on both sides, he walked between the bodies, knee-deep and in their thousands, as the snow began to fall in a miserable grey spill. Around him, warriors in clanking, crushing armour plate strode among the fallen, dragging comrades from the corpse heaps and executing wounded foes with swift plunges of cackling chain blades. The Emperor paid heed to none of this. The theatre of a battle's aftermath held no claim on his attention. He walked on, stepping over his own injured men who called for his aid, approaching a ring of his elite warriors. They guarded a lone grey-haired figure, clad in an unreliably cloned fur cloak. The captured man hugged himself against the biting cold, standing and a little hunched over from his wounds. He looked up as the Emperor approached. He smiled without showing bloody teeth. So this is how it ends. The Emperor stood still, saying nothing. The wind pulled at his long hair. The weak sun glinted in flashes from his lowered sword. Why? The captive asked bitterly. Why annihilate my people like this? Your people will be allowed to live on, replied the Emperor. Your army and you yourself could not. The Emperor of Terror, the grey-haired captive said, with a laughing sneer. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The wound in his gut was eating him alive. No, said the Emperor. The Emperor of mankind. The prisoner hawked blood onto the snow. Of mankind now. One nation wasn't enough for you, not even one world. So you'll take your cancerous touch to the stars. Your defiance is ill-placed, the Emperor replied. Arrogant beast, he wheezed through the ruination of his chest. Hubris beyond reckoning, madness beyond definition. The Emperor turned into the wind, narrowing his eyes as he looked across the ravaged battlefield. And yet victory. Tyrant, the captive screamed. Butcher of the enlightened. Spit sprayed into the evening air, steaming where it landed. Apostate, heretic. The Emperor endured this spittle, punctuated tirade with a quiet patience, somewhere between dignity and immunity. I bring illumination, he said. You bring damnation, the captured warlord raged. I warned you, priest, said the Emperor. Long ago I warned you. We stand here now because of the choices you made. I pissed on your warnings then, the captive snapped back, and I piss on your enlightenment now. Let the sword fall. I go to my God's embrace, and with my last breath I will curse the blood in your veins. One of the custodians, encircling him, moved forward, pounding the butt of his guardian spear into the side of the man's head. Though he pulled the blow, scarcely seeking to injure, let alone kill, it was enough to break the man's eye socket and burst the orb within, turning it into shattered jelly. The captive warlord went down into the snow, howling, clutching his savaged skull. Restrain yourself, Sagittarius, the Emperor said. The custodian hesitated, bowed his head to his master, then returned to the ranks. Much later, the Emperor himself speaks to one of the custodies, called Ra, about this moment. I met him long before he was the priest king, the Emperor said. He began as a holy man, a mendicant preacher, wandering the northern wastes, gathering untainted food and purified water, giving it freely to those in need. He claimed it was his calling, and that his God lived in his kindness. It was a calling, of course, a call that was answered by the beings of the Immaterium. They gave him the power to feed his beleaguered tribe and heal their ills, and his clan grew. When savage winters ate away at the other tribes, his clan sheltered beneath the protection of his power. He kept them fed, protected, and unseen from the eyes of their hunting foes. Soon hundreds of men and women were huddling for warmth within his mercy, and offering their thanks to the God that he believed he served. Yet each miracle took more effort, more sacrifice. The end always justified the means. First of the conundrums were moral in nature. What does it matter if another clan starves, if it allows his tribe to survive? Soon enough the rituals grew more occult in order to achieve their ends. What is the murder of a rival, if that guarantees another 10 years of peace? What is the life of one child, if the offer of its bloody beating heart will ensure a monarch's immortality? Ra stared down at the kneeling, bleeding priest-king. Gone were the gene abominations and witchcraft-marked men in their thousands that had formed his ragged armies. He was alone, moments from his breathing his last. Soon his sick blood would taint the Emperor's blade. Think of this man's clan, continued the Emperor. As a holy man, he had begun with offers of food and the promise of survival. Sensing his susceptibility, the warp darkened around the candle flame of his life's light. He prayed and the warp answered. Soon his people were too numerous to hide. Other tribes came for his clan's riches. This man, this revered holy man, led his people to the machines of the old ages, cloning and replicating and using gene-forged, flawed warriors to wage war for territory. The clan branded their own flesh and ran to war alongside these genetic brutes, crying up to the sky for the same power their overlord enjoyed. And how far they had fallen, committing any act in the belief of their own righteousness, all from superstition, all from ignorance, all because one charismatic man believed that the power that heeded his calls could be trusted. By the time he realized they could not, he believed himself powerful enough to control them, independent enough to resist them. What harm in one more gift if it allowed his clan to thrive? What harm in one more sacrifice if it ensured a strong harvest or victory in a coming war? And when it came time to die, what would be this powerful independent man do? Would he go silently into the ground? Would he slumber upon a funeral pyre? Or would he, for the good of his people, reach for longer life at any cost, because only he can lead them? Ra still stared at the defeated monarch. The custodian knew all there was to know from the archives. He knew of the barbarity practiced by the Mand-Sen Confederacy. He had seen picked evidence of the bone pits, those Golgothan barrows. Every day of his adult life, he had fought alongside other golden armoured warriors who had been there for the dismantling of the Confederacy itself. The priest-king could hardly have appeared less like his treacherously magnificent depictions, with his red robes of office reduced to scorched rags hanging at the edges of his broken armour, and the cloak of clone fur blackened from flaming burners. The great demagogue stared up at the Emperor, with the unshattered half of his face dirtied by blood and matted hair. Behind him the custodians seized something. Talons rippled in the shadows, cast by the man's cloak, glassy and obsidian, impossibly liquid in their caress. Claws clicked and scratched against one another. Inside, the wide pupil that looked like a hole drilled into the yellowing white of the priest-king's remaining eye. Bulges wormed their maggoty way through the man's veins, bubonically swollen. The defeated warlord, this impoverished and humbled ruler, was riven from within. Then, with the sudden crack of an aggravated power field, blood sizzled on the Emperor's blade. The priest-king's headless body toppled, neck stump steaming into the dirty snow. Sagittarius gripped the severed head by its long hair, holding it up for the miserable sky. He roared, and thousands of thunder warriors roared with him. The Emperor cleaned and deactivated his blade on the dead man's cloak, then sheathed his sword across his back, and the Emperor rested an armoured boot on the priest-king's head. Knee servos thrummed. He hesitated for the span of a single breath, as all eyes fell upon him. Then the boot came down, grinding the trophy into the dirt beneath the snow. When he lifted his tread, Nothing but wet red shards remained, stringy with slick hair. "Burn the body," said the Emperor. "Burn all their bodies." Thunder warriors came forwards, armed with flamers. And that is the second excerpt, and completes our coverage of the Mand-Sen fighting during the Unification Wars against the Master of Mankind. My personal favourite battle during the Unification Wars of Terror involves the Salamanders and the Emperor against the Ethnarchy, who have both Dark Age of technology and Psykers to oppose them, and has some of the coolest Salamander moments. It's the assault on the Tempest galleries. What proto-men of iron do the Astartes face? How do the Salamanders come to live by their name? And what powers the fields that stops the Emperor getting in to face the Ethnarchy more conventionally? Let's begin. One of the last great battles of the Unification Wars, the conquest of the Caucasus Wastes, would see at last the Emperor as the undisputed master of terror, but victory would not prove easy. The mutated eugenicist oligarchy, who ruled the wastes, presented the Emperor's forces with one of the most difficult challenges they faced in open warfare. While few in number compared to the savage warbands of Ursh, the Ethnarchy's power was based on scores of relic technologies, and the terrible weapons in their possession which dated back to before the Age of Strife, while its military forces ranged from armoured gene-augmented Urcasis, roughly analogous to the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, to narcotically enslaved Psychicovans. The Ethnarchy's strongholds were concealed kilometres deep beneath the hollowed-out mountains of the wastes, and shielded from attack from above by near-impregnable power field webs. An attempt by the Imperial forces to take the Ethnarchy's mountain strongholds by storming earlier in the Unification Wars had met with bloody defeat, with the loss of almost 10,000 Thunder Warriors and more than 1 million other casualties, but had seen the Caucasus Wastes contained and isolated thereafter. So it was that when the hour of the Emperor's vengeance came around, nothing was to be left to chance. The forces of 6 entire proto-legions of the Legiones Astartes were mustered for the final assault on the Caucasus Wastes, along with the massed forces of the Custodian Guard, with the Emperor himself to lead them, and countless other armies, mechanised battalions and warrior bands, beneath the Raptor and Lightning banner of Unification. But of all of these, the first thrust upon which all else would depend, the Emperor entrusted to the nascent Salamander's Legion. Although the decision to utilise what they considered to be a largely unknown and untested unit in so vital a role was questioned by many within the Imperial command, the Emperor's will was obeyed. The Salamanders would carry the assault, utilising scores of freshly created, gigantic, termite, subterranean boring machines fitted with recently acquired technology from Mars. The full force of the Proto-Legion came, some 20,000 Legiones Astartes, at this juncture, was committed to what was widely believed to be a suicide mission to attack and destroy the vast geothermal furnaces which provided the power of the Ethnarchy's impregnable defences. These were housed far below even the subterranean strongholds, and known of only through ancient legend, in a 100-kilometre long string of vast artificially created caverns, known as the Tempest galleries, for the incessant storms of flames and electromagnetic force which bled from the ancient and little understood relic machineries. Their specially modified power armour, camouflaged in striated patterns of sulphur yellow and sable black, the Salamanders saluted the Emperor and calmly mounted the untested Martian engines and pierced the dark earth and rock at the edge of the wastes, disappearing into a deadly and unknown world. Soon all signals were lost, and not even the power of the Imperial Psykers could penetrate the turbulent depths to maintain contact with the assault force. Hours stretched into days, and days became weeks. The Emperor was pressed by his commanders to take action, and it is said that the Emperor silenced them and replied, "They shall not fail me. They will return from the fire. Thus it shall ever be." Reports claim that moments after the Emperor spoke, great tremors and earthquakes shook the region. In their wake, the power webs that had for so long shielded the wastes failed, and the full force of the Emperor's wrath fell upon them to their utter destruction. The last Ethnarch was dragged in chains to the prison of Kambat Maru, and the brood secrets that had been his strength were taken by the now uncontested Master of Terror. Of the fate of the Salamanders, nothing was known until the closing days of the campaign, when far from the wastes a long dormant volcano shattered, and one of the termite machines hauled itself from the rubble, carrying just over 1,000 survivors from the Salamanders. The task force after action reports were immediately analysed by the Imperial command structure, and had they not been accompanied by supporting evidence and hololithic records, it is likely that they would have been greeted with disbelief. Almost 4/5 of the task force had survived the journey to their objective, the rest being destroyed by the plethora of environmental hazards, crushed like eggshells between grinding tectonic plates, or incinerated by seas of magma when their shielding failed. Those who breached the lined caverns of the Tempest galleries found a strange, imprisoned world, as alien as anything the Great Crusade would see among the stars. Vast, kilometre-high spindle machines turned over caged seas of molten metal drawn from the planet's very core, spewing forth coronas of blinding lightning, while suspended on silicate webs across which unfathomable and inhuman machines scuttled like spiders. In this airless furnace, beyond mortal endurance, the legionaries of the Salamanders found no warrior of the Ethnarch to contest them, for nothing human had set foot in this hell for millennia, but rather the defenders of these sleepless engines they had turned since before the age of strife were fire-blackened service automata, reacting to the outsider's threat as antibodies would against an invading infection in a living body. Incredibly strong and built to withstand the ravages of the firestorm that surrounded them, each would have overmatched battle automata of the Mechanicum, of its size and power, being products as they were of mankind's ancient past. There were thousands of these Tempest automata, and all turned to attack the Salamanders. Neither plasma nor melter weapons could breach their armour, while bolter shells rippled across them like rain. Only massive kinetic force, applied at close range against their articulated joints, was able to disable them, a lesson that cost the Salamanders hundreds of lives to learn, as they were forced into a running battle of attrition with the relentless machines, and cut off when many of their termite carriers were targeted and crushed by the colossal articulated, toothed metal spheres used by the ancient workings to tunnel and expand the galleries. The Salamanders held out with a mixture of stoic resilience and suicidal fury, maintaining discipline, order, despite the onslaught as a whole, while individual legionaries hurled themselves willingly to their deaths to grapple with the killing machines, so that they might be destroyed and their brothers' lives saved. Fighting now for survival from gallery to gallery, they collapsed tunnels and severed the silicate webs behind them to impede their pursuers and buy themselves time. But their casualties were huge, with thousands having perished within the first dozen hours of the conflict. But the precious time they had, purchased with blood, however, would be spent well by the survivors. For it would be neither the Legion's immense resilience nor its willing artifice that would see them victorious, but their intellect, their intelligence, showing the aptitude for technology and craft for which they would become justly famed. They began to first use the wreckage of the attacking machines and the heavy machinery that surrounded them as salvage to repair and augment their own expended war gear, and soon this escalated to tearing from the automatons their central control systems and repairing them sufficiently to be sent crashing back into their own ranks as mindless berserkers. This proved only the start. Power conduits were redirected and machine death traps created. Cyclopean lightning rods, conducting the power of the howling electromagnetic corona above, were fashioned into improvised harpoon weapons to burn out the hearts of the largest machine beasts. Rivers of molten metal redirected into service tunnels. Atomantic chambers compromised to detonate like miniature suns, shattering engines that had endured for tens of thousands of years. Soon something like a stalemate had been achieved, but at a terrible cost. Less than a third of the salamander's original number remained. The body of the vast system had been badly wounded, but a mortal blow was not yet struck. In the inaccessible deeps, the ancient machine spirit that bound the Tempest galleries together was manufacturing fresh soldiers for its cause, and that was something the legionaries Astartes could not match. Realising this strategic reality, the Legion hatched a plan to commit its forces to a single coherent attack and destroy. The plan was to attack and cripple the central power transmission node in the largest of the chambers yet discovered. The reasoning behind that, even if the vast generator spindles were not put out of action, it would successfully interrupt the flow of energy to the defences far above. A two-pronged assault strategy was devised. The 1st Division would mount a series of divisionary attacks at other locations to confuse the enemy. Once this was underway, the 2nd Lardish Division would assault the power node. It was assumed that while survival was in many ways unlikely, death for the central assault force would be certain. For this reason, the Salamander's surviving commanders acquiesced to the wishes of the Legion's rank and file and assigned legionaries by lottery. Not because they had no volunteers for the main assault force, quite the contrary, but because it was the fervent wish of all to take part. When the assault came, the legionaries thundered from their holdouts and defensive redoubts, many armed with improvised power fists and thunder hammers, shock cannon and cutting saws fashioned from the shattered remains of fallen Tempest automata. With them came their full reserves of munitions and manpower. Nothing was held back. Attacked suddenly from many fronts, the inhuman intelligence which oversaw the Tempest galleries responded with cold machine logic, efficiently dividing and dispatching its forces to deal with the threats. The fighting was savage, but the plan was working, and the concentrated force of the main assault group managed to smash its way into the Great Gallery, its few remaining dreadnoughts and rapier batteries leading the way. Like a hive of ants cruelly kicked open, the Tempest automata responded in a tide of scorched black metal and snapping servo claws, slamming into the Legion head-on across the silicate bridges suspended between the sea of fire below and the hurricane of lightning far above. Bodies by the hundred, machine and legionary alike, fell into the burning abyss. Severed power cables sparked furiously, mechanical bodies exploded in sheets of fire and shrapnel, while spilled blood vaporized to steam in the superheated air. Slowly, tortuously, the Legion fought its way to the towering power node at the centre of the gallery, buying each metre of ground taken with dozens of lives. It was then the Kraken rose from the depths. A vast, articulated beast machine appeared, the greatest of the engines that maintained the Tempest galleries, sheathed in armoured scales of synthetic black diamond, molten metal running off it like water. Its coils could have crushed a battle titan, and were more than sufficient to enwrap and shatter the silicate bridges on which the Legion fought. Their weapons utterly useless against this new foe, the survivors were forced to attempt a fighting retreat. Their new was futile, as one by one the silicate strands were severed, and hundreds more fell to their doom. What occurred next can only be guessed at, but the last garbled transmission from the Great Gallery was one of the huge grav-propelled tunnelling spheres used by the Tempest automata, crashing through the gallery wall and plunging past the Kraken engine and directly at the node nexus. It is believed that the only possible explanation of this is that one part of the diversionary attack group had used the confusion of the battle to gain control of one of the colossal serrated tunnelling spheres and set upon using it as a last-ditch weapon. Regardless of the cause, whether Legion action or the calamity of one of its own automata gone haywire, the node structure exploded, collapsing the gallery around it and blowing out numerous surrounding caverns and tunnels, and creating The earthquakes and tremors felt across the region. The explosion also appears to have murdered the governing machine spirit of the galleries, for in the aftermath, the automata simply shut off, the machinery stilled, the vast spindle generators sinking slowly and silently into the fires below, never to return again. Little more than 1,000 of the 20,000 strong salamanders survived. Those who did were scattered across the Tempest galleries, many conducting diversionary attacks at its fringes and once again displaying formidable fortitude and perseverance in regrouping and intelligence in rebuilding one of the damaged termite transporters for the arduous journey back to the surface. Upon their return, the Emperor himself gathered the survivors together and awarded them the laurel of victory for the campaign against the Ethnarch, to the dissatisfaction of some commanders. It would be forever theirs, and their first battle honour inscribed with the motto, "In fire and darkness tested." This was to prove prophetic, and the action of the Tempest galleries a high bar indeed for the Legion's prowess, and a standard of sacrifice and victory against the odds that would prove a punitive taskmaster for the Legion in the early years of the Great Crusade. It is an interesting addendum to the record of this battle that the salamanders, the survivors, brought with them from the Tempest galleries metallurgy and machinecraft predating the age of strife, the secrets of which, in addition to being given over to the Imperial command, were retained by the Legion itself. The first Pacification of Luna was the first operation mounted by elements of the Legiones Astartes beyond the skies of terror. The wars of unity below were still raging. Luna was the bastion of a conglomeration of resurrectionist gene cults, the members of these cults believing that human nature was both fractal, fractured, and transcendent. To them, the true nature of mankind was visible in the flesh and mind of the individual, and that each person was an echo of the archetypes that persisted throughout human existence. Each cult clung to a different set of archetypes. Some represented them as anthropomorphic figures, some as numbers, and some as symbolic systems, shot through with low occultism. Most fell short of deification, but all pursued understanding through their craft of gene forging. Each cult member was a product, not of random breeding, but creation by the cult gene rights, according to the formula born in the dark age of technology. Resurrected in body, time and time again, they attempted to reach a true personification of a single archetype. In their subterranean complexes, the cults were powerful, insular, and resistant to the imperial truth. Such resistance was hardly a novelty, and would normally have been dealt with in the usual manner, by obliteration. The fact that the gene cults had something that the growing Imperium needed complicated that position. Clouded as it might have been by occultism, the genecraft of the Selenar lunar cults was unqualified save within the Emperor's own facilities. With terror teetering on the edge of complete unification, the conquest of the Sol system and the galaxy beckoned. For that crusade, there would need to be more and more space marines. The Terran facilities could not be able to cope with such a huge increase to the creations of recruits for the legions, so the Imperium needed Luna's wealth of genecraft and capacity added to its own. But the Selenar gene cults would not bow willingly to the hunger of the newborn Imperium, and had fought off the machinations of Terran warlords and Martian Magos. In the past, the Selenar had received Imperial ambassadors with courtesy, but answered their offers with threats and entreaties, and often silence. As the threats began to outnumber the offers, the lunar cults began to turn away the ambassadors, and the idea then was to gird themselves for war. Normally highly factional, the possibility of Terran domination overcame all doctrinal disagreements between the cults, matriarchs and gene rights. They would resist the Imperium together, and without limit. The final Imperial deputation to Luna was returned to Terra as a still screaming soup of fused liquid flesh in the dead shell of their shuttle. So it was that the Emperor ordered the lunar cults to be pacified, their beliefs broken and their craft yoked to the needs of the Imperium. It could be no simple conquest by destruction. The gene forgers had to remain intact, as did the cult gene rights that mastered them. A single blow had to cut away the cult's beliefs and their will to resist, To this task, the Emperor set 3 of his legions, most suited to his purpose, on what some chroniclers name as the first true battle of the Great Crusade. The Sons of Horus had been chosen for the force's vanguard, operating in full strength, free of Terra's pull. Their assault craft cut their power ice cold and silent, to mask themselves from detection, set to drift towards the silver disk of Luna like arrows fired into the night. Only Space Marines, clad as they were in suit-sealed armour, could have enacted such a plan and lived. Within the void-cold interiors of each craft, the warriors of the Sons of Horus waited in the airless dark, their armour rimed with ice. Behind them came a smaller wave of craft carrying elements of the Ultramarines and the Imperial Fists, their engines burning and their skins glittering with void shields. This second wave was the show of might that the gene cults expected, and a perfect distraction from the first. Fire filled the space between Terra and its only moon. Weapon systems embedded in Luna's surface lashed the oncoming assault force. But even as the guns fired, the Sons of Horus assault craft, unlooked for and unseen, struck their targets like a dagger in the night. The previous ambassadors sent to Luna had not been of a total waste. By the time the Sons of Horus Legion's assault craft slipped the gravity of Terra, the location of each defensive battery and cult leader was known, and the Sons of Horus hit each with overwhelming force, smashing aside defences and breaching the tunnel. Complexes below, regardless of what half-machine monsters of the Selenar's genecraft were thrown against them, and they had been able to do this because of the ambassador's information. And it is said that those looking up at the night sky of Terra could see the face of Luna glitter with flames. The defence batteries fell within seconds, the corridors of their silos running with blood from the slaughter. Of the 100 or more cult leaders scattered across Luna, most died without realising they were under direct assault. Those that did not die fled as hulking warriors in pale grey armour smashed into their refuges and gutted them of life. Without defence systems and the direction of their leaders, the Selenar cult could do nothing as more Space Marines attacked. They landed and began to systematically break their remaining strongpoints and isolate pockets of resistance. Within a mere 6 hours of the first shot being fired, Luna was pacified. Faced with annihilation, the surviving Selenar bent the knee instead, their surrender communique calling for the Emperor to call off his wolves. Broken and humbled, the enslaved gene rights of Luna would help forge the next generation of Legiones Astartes and fuel the conquest of the stars. Now we examine the Achaemenid Empire. They were very wealthy. The kings of the empire were allies with the Master of Mankind. This alliance spared them the horrors of atomic war or the invasion of the Thunder Warriors. Aramid of the Thousand Suns was brought up in that place. I mention this as he has an interesting observation about the Thunder Warriors, within whose bodies the Emperor had implanted full-grown biological hardware and mechanical augmentations to boost their strength, endurance and speed. They were monstrous things, and most were eventually driven insane by the demands their enhanced physiques made upon them. The biological heritage of the people of this area was not contaminated like the flaws and viral defects that inflicted many of the other Earth tribes, so the Emperor walked among the populace with his army of scientists, testing each and every family, grouping for the required genetic markers. The people of that place, including Aramid, was recruited to the Astartes. They were each given a talisman that represented the strength of the greatest ruler of that empire. The charm was to keep them safe. The people of this empire were also taught to value truth above all else, to hunt and kill and debate if you were the sons of royalty. And, in a further part to the Unification Wars, we have a conflict which is basically one line in a Custodes Codex, and it says that in Atlan, the Ur Queen was killed by the Custodes. A long holdout against the future Master of Mankind was High Brazil. By the time the Imperium was being built, Lord Ferron Siccar was hereditary Lord of High Brazil, the most powerful of all these sub-American cantons. Siccar had often been vocal in his criticism of imperial policies. His dynastic links, through bloodline and marriage, to the Navis nobility provided him with a considerable trade empire off Terra. Siccar was reckoned to be one of the most powerful feudal lords of the colonies. Only the most careful political gamesmanship by Malcador the Sigillite had prevented Sikar's elevation to the Lords of Terror, and the power that would bring. This concern and his exclusion from that position came as he was a direct descendant of Dalmoth Kin, one of the last tyrants to hold out against the Emperor's forces in the dying days of the Unification Wars. It was understood that the Emperor tolerated Sikar's rule of High Brazil and his barracking and sniping in the hegemon in order to heal the old wounds left by the Wars of Unification and encourage ethnic settlement. Sikar was a powerful man and both an articulate person and statesman. He often spoke tolerable sense. His policies were pragmatic and robust. His opposition to imperial directives was not so fierce it required him to be placed under house arrest, like Lady Calhoun of Lanark, or be removed from office entirely and charged with treason to the imperial state, like Hans Gargetten, Chancellor of the Atlantic Platforms. But Sikar was always to be handled with caution. With his military campaigns completed, the Master of Mankind wanted to spread the imperial truth across Terra, for mankind to embrace science and atheism. He destroyed churches in line with this. The final church standing on Terra is the Church of the Lightning Stone. The priest there once fought against the Emperor. At the battle, the human army against the Emperor was 50,000 strong, and they faced less than a tenth of the forces under the Big E. They felt they could win. They charged from the hillside like mad, glorious fools, screaming war cries and waving swords, pistols and rifles above their heads. The Emperor's forces did not move as the charge happened. When those who opposed the Emperor got close, his forces opened fire. With that thunderstorm, the rebels' first 5 ranks were cut down to a man. The fallen didn't even have time to scream before death greeted them. The Emperor's forces tore limbs from bodies, or simply burst men apart like wet sacks. The charge had ground to a halt. Men and women milled around in confusion and fear as they suddenly understood the reality of what the rebel leader Havelek had begun. The Thunder Warriors put up their guns and marched towards us, unsheathing swords with serrated edges and motorized blades that roared like something stepping from nightmare. The rebel leader Havelez fell dead in the middle of the field. The lower half of his body had been blown clean off. The army begged for mercy. Even when they threw down their weapons, the Thunder Warriors did not stop. Those begging were hacked down. The fallen forces were cut apart and brutalized with economy of force. It was a mechanized butcher, and the priest is unable to stop the fall of the last church, his church, on Terra. In a brief part of his Terran campaign, next up we have Adedeji, which ruled an area of ancient Terra, which would be around the approximate area of North Africa in our world. When the Master of Mankind came to their doorstep, they resisted his will, his coming, and so they were made low and made to become factory workers. And generations later, this is still the case. Many powers had tried to resist the Emperor. Some, like the ruling family of Boeotia, had held out for decades, negotiating and conniving their way around treaties and rapprochements and every other diplomatic tool and effort designed to bring them under imperial sway. The story demonstrated that the Emperor, or his advisors at least, possessed extraordinary patience. In the wake of the Unification War, there had been a strenuous and high-profile effort to resolve conflicts through non-violent means, and the Yselti were not tyrants or despots. They were simply an ancient royal house eager to maintain their autonomous existence. The Emperor allowed them a twilight grace of a century and a half to come to terms, longer than the lifespan of many Terran empires. The story also demonstrated that the Emperor's patience was finite, and that when it was exhausted, so was his mercy and restraint. The Imperial army had advanced into Boeotia to arrest the Yselti and annex the territory. They were followed by the Thousand Sons to wrap up and complete things, to end their opposition. The first use that the Emperor put his Night Lords to was to bring to heel those who believed that the sins of the past could live on in the new Imperium. Several of those who had bent their knee to the Emperor had done so because they believed that it was the only choice. Others, having seen the empires of warlords rise and fall, believed that they were simply part of a temporary arrangement. Crimes against the new order took many faces, from the Sargon enclave, whose gene atrocities continued in secret, to the cybreeding of the court of Antiochus and the march of 10 million, all showed that even in the face of all the emperor's might, some would fall back into the ways of old night. When such crimes required not simply crushing, but retribution, the emperor sent the Night Lord's legion. Such actions seemed very well suited to the Night Lords, whether as a consequence of their genetic inheritance or the combination of their origins and indoctrination. The warriors of the Legion seem to have tended towards moral absolutism and a drive to enact retribution. There were no shades of grey in their moral universe, no degrees of guilt or innocence. Truth and falsehood was as day to night, indivisible and unqualified. The dark was the realm of guilt, lies and monsters, and those who dwelt in the dark knew only the language of blood, the message of swift and merciless retribution for their actions. Justice brought the light to darkness, and justice was neither warm nor caring, but as indifferent and cold as the edge of a knife. The warriors of the Night Lords were creatures made to live in the dark and to fight a war for a future of light. In their core, they were warriors for a future without creatures of their kind. At least that is what those who knew them now say. Perhaps memory is too kind. Perhaps we wish to believe that there is a nobility in such monsters, where in fact there is only horror. Perhaps we wish there to be a purpose behind atrocity. Otherwise, how could such creatures be suffered to live? And unleashed on the Sargon enclave, it is the Night Lords that destroy viciously this opponent to the Emperor's might. An area called Occitania was ruled by the king Gotha. They opposed the Emperor, but were defeated, but this cost the lives of almost all the Night Lords to achieve this. Gotha after was one of the first to accept the rank of a rogue trader. In return, his sentence of execution was commuted. The Indonesic bloc was ruled over by Cardinal Tang. He was the tyrant, the ethnarch, and he ruled throughout the Age of Strife and the Unification Wars as well. He used faith as his unifying weapon. After he came to power, Tang imposed a horrible regime on the islands in the bloc. He made sure those citizens considered compatible on a genetic level were together. If a child was considered genetically inferior, they would be removed from further using the bloc's resources. When the Emperor launched his war, Tang was his enemy for a long time, holding many fortress zones, when the rest of Terra was under the dominion of the first and last Lord of the Imperium. When the last bastion belonging to Tang was taken, Tang himself was captured alive and locked up in a penal colony of Nusa Kambangan, which later became a hive. He only lasted a few days until inmates learned his identity and murdered the former warlord. In Albion, a warlord, Julian the Red, is beaten by a rival Kabuka's forces and locked in a prison, where Kabuka himself would eventually end up later, we are told. They knew it simply as the Vault. Kangbat Maru had always been part of the mountain, or at least so it seemed to those who even knew of it. It had always been a site of incarceration, a hidden place to cage the most violent, the most dangerous and the most reprehensible evils the world had known. No one knew who had first hacked its cells and passageways from the bedrock of the mountain, but its origins went far beyond the limits of memory and surviving documentation. Stories of the criminals incarcerated in its lightless depths stretched back thousands of years, their names now meaningless and their crimes long forgotten. Yet there were villains aplenty plucked from living memory, who had darkened its sterile corridors and died insane within its unfeeling walls. The lieutenants of the Pan-Pacific tyrant had been brought here, as had the ethnarch of the Caucasus Wastes, the so-called First Emperor, and a being known only as the Reaper, a monster that legend said was an angel sent to cleanse mankind from the world. Julian the Red, the tyrannical, blood-drinking prince of Albion, had been brought here for execution after his defeat at the Battle of the Blue Dawn. Ulium's debased followers conquered a quarter of the globe, but were finally halted by an army of powerful warriors, raised by a Nordafric warlord known as Gibuka, who was said to have called lightning from the clouds and granted his warriors superhuman strength. In time, Gibuka himself was hauled in chains to the vault, but no history remained to tell of who had overturned his rule. A persistent rumour told that the Emperor himself had designed a cell especially for Nathan Doom, but which had gone unused following the tyrant's death during the final battle to bring down his inhuman regime. Whispers maintained it had been the urging of Constantine Valdor that saw Durm executed in the ruins of his empire, a half-mad, half-genius psychopath deemed too dangerous to live. Cardinal Tang had been bound for this specialised jail, but like Durm, he never saw the inside of his cell. Inmates who had suffered the worst tortures imaginable in his bloody pogroms broke open his isolation tank and tore his body apart with their bare hands before his transit from Nusa could be arranged. Now we turn to two more places that challenged the Emperor during the Unification Wars. Orlock, who opened fire on the Legion the Emperor sent to pacify them, and Ursh, who are allied with Gene Horrors and Psychers. They are a strong and startling example of what the Emperor was trying to stamp out when he was uniting terror. Let's begin. Orlock was a city-state of old Earth, buried in a hollowed-out mountain in ancient Terra's ice-bound south. It stood throughout the darkness of old night, weathering the storms of strife for thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands lived and died in its geothermally heated caverns, sweating in workshops and skimming algae lakes for food. All of them knew that their role, that they alone were the chosen of ancient Terra's blighted children, and that they alone would outlast the anarchy that had broken so much else. This certainty came from their faith in a protection more than any fortress walls, the favour of the spirits of life and death. For centuries that stretched back beyond the memory, the people of Orlock had believed that all existence was the result of the interaction between the spirits of the dead and the forces of life. They believed the dead were glimpsed in dreams, shadows, and the echoes of the night. The power of life could be seen in light, air, and the heat of fire. Within each of these two forces existed countless powers, beings formed from the souls of the dead and those yet to be born. Humans could never touch or understand these beings, but they could see their footprints in the changing of the world, in disaster and fortune, in sadness and joy, wrath and peace. These beings had names that stretched back to before any could remember. Ishantel, the speaker of night; Zoruz, the beast-head spirit of starlight; the faceless messenger of fate was another, and many hundreds more. Their statues and fanes looked down from the cavern roofs of Orlock with eyes cut from moonstone, jet and topaz. As the rest of ancient Terra fell to the Emperor's armies, Orlock waited, sure that their time would come, and certain that they would survive as they always did. When the Emperor's eye finally turned to the mountain city, he seems to have known that soft words and diplomatic overtures would be of little use. The Imperial heralds came to the city and gave it a choice: kneel and accept the Imperial truth, or be destroyed. The priest-kings did not even hear the message before they gave their answer. Fire met the Imperial herald's transport, and as it fell to the ice plains, the Word-Bearers' Legion began their attack. Macro-bombers came out of the snow-filled sky, and the mountain cracked under a rain of seismic charges. Within the mountain, the statues and fanes shattered, raining fragments onto the cavern floor as the populace cried for the spirits of the dead to aid them. No help came. On the mountain's flanks, siege tanks coughed shell after shell into fractures in the rock, breaking them wide open. Ice and snow swirled into the cavern city, and winds filled with the smell of shattered stone and chemical fire. Behind the wind came the great armoured warriors, advancing in a relentless drum roll of gunfire and the hiss of flame. Any who stood before them died. Any who begged for mercy were released to oblivion's peace. After 3 hours, the remaining populace were a huddled flock, crammed into the central cavern beneath the stone eyes of their gods. With every other tunnel and cavern district wiped clean of life, the word-bearers halted, sealing the ways in and out of the central cavern, but not advancing to take it. As the hours stretched on in fretful silence, the survivors wondered what fate awaited them, whether the will of the gods had spared them, or whether they had been deserted. The answer came in a rain of shattered stone and red fire. Seismic charges broke upon the crown of the mountain, and the circle of ashes descended on the last idolaters, like comets flung from a destroyed heaven. All burned, none was spared, and when it was done, the Wordbearer's Legion overloaded the geothermal power plants beneath the mountain. Lava filled the caverns, swallowing the stone idols, and exploded from the wounds in the mountain's flanks to pour across the ice sheets. The cloud of ash and steam covered the southern hemisphere. Even in the far north, black rain fell from the smoke-stained sky, and so fell Orlock, and the message of its death carried across ancient terror and beyond. Faith in false gods will bring only ruin and ashes. What we know of Ursh comes from chronicles that are read during the Horus Heresy. Let's read through and read along with it and get a sense of what this place was like. The chronicles were as raw and brutal as Cinderman had promised. Long-forgotten cities were routinely sacked, or burned, or simply evaporated in nuclear storms. Seas were regularly stained with blood, skies with ash, and landscapes were often carpeted with the bleached and numberless bones of the conquered. When armies marched, they marched 1 billion strong, the ragged banners of 1,000,000 standards swaying above their heads in the atomic winds. The battles were stupendous maelstroms of blades and spiked black helms and baying horns, lit by the fires of cannons and burners. Page after page celebrated the cruel practices and equally cruel character of the despot Callaghan. He, the point of view person reading this Locan, quickly became absorbed by a sequence detailing Shankar's campaigns against the Nordofric conclaves. Shankar had assembled a significant horde of irregular levies from the southern client states of Ursh and used them to support his main armed strengths, including the infamous Tuple of Lancers and the Red Engines during the invasion. The Nordofric technogogues had preserved a great deal more high technology for the good of their conclaves than Ursh possessed, and sheer envy more than anything motivated the war. Callaghan was hungry for the fine instruments and mechanisms the conclaves owned. 8 epic battles marked Shankar's advance into the Nordofric zones, the greatest of them being Zoser. Over a period of 9 days and nights, the war machines of the Red Engines blasted their way across the cultivated agroponic pastures and reduced them back to the desert from which they had originally been irrigated and nurtured. They cut through the laser-thorn hedges and the jewelled walls of the outer conclave and unleashed dirty atomics into the ruling heart of the ruling zone. Before the Lancers led a tidal wave of screaming berserkers through the breach into the earthly paradise of the gardens at Zoser, the last fragment of Eden on a corrupted planet. At the heart of the ruling zone, a 9th minor battle had marked the conquest, almost as an afterthought. One bastion had remained, the Muranjan, or walled sanctuary where the last hierophants of the conclaves held out, practising, so the text said, their sciomancy by the flame light of their burning realm. Shankar wished swift revolution to the conquest, and had sent Anult Kaiser to crush the sanctuary. Kaiser was Lord Marshal of the Tuple of Lancers, and by various bonds of honour could call freely upon the services of the Roma, a squadron of mercenary flyers whose richly decorated interceptors, legend said, never landed or touched the earth, but lived eternity in the scope of the air. During the advance on the Muranjan, Kaiser's interpretation of dreams had warned of the Hierophant's sciomancy and their phantasmagorian ways. When the battle began, just as the interceptor of dreams had warned, magics were unleashed. Plagues of insects as thick as monsoon rain, and so vast in their swirling masses that they blacked out the sun, fell upon Kaiser's forces, choking air intakes, weapon ports, visors, ears, mouths, and throats. Water boiled without fire, engines overheated or burned out. Men turned to stone, or their bones turned to paste, or their flesh succumbed to boils and bubbling flesh and flaked off their limbs. Others went mad. Some became demons and turned upon their own. When Shankal heard the news, he flew into a fury and went at once to the scene, bringing with him what the text describes as the Wraith Singers, who appeared to be magi of some kind. The leader or master was a man called Maffeo Order, and somehow Order drew the Wraith Singers into kind of remote warfare with the Hierophants. The text was annoyingly vague about exactly what occurred next, almost as if it was beyond the understanding of the writer. Words such as sorcery and magic were employed frequently without qualification, and there were invocations to dark primordial gods that the writer clearly thought his audience would have some prior knowledge of. The earth trembled as if afraid, the sky tore like silk. Many in the earth-shaped force heard the voices of the dead whispering to them. Men caught fire and walked around, bathed in lambent flames that did not consume them, they merely pleaded for help. The remote war between the Wraith Singers and the Hierophants lasted for 6 days, and when it ended, the ancient desert was thick with snow, and the skies had turned blood red. The air formations of the Roma had been forced to flee, lest their craft be torn from the heavens by screaming angels and dashed upon the ground. At the end of it, all the Wraith Singers were dead, except Order himself. The Moonjin was a smoking hole in the ground, its stone walls so hideously melted by heat that they had become slips of glass, and the Hierophants were extinct. In our final video covering the Emperor's battle to unite Terra, we cover Albia, who proved strong opposition to the Big East forces, and Akkad, who faced the First Legion of the Emperors, the Dark Angels. See how the early deployments shaped their character. Now, let's begin. The Death Guard, who were better known at this time as the Dusk Raiders, recruited heavily from the warlike clans of Old Albia. The recruitment of the Sons of Albia served two purposes for the newborn Imperium. Firstly, and most importantly, it drew off the cream of whole generations of strength from a Terran realm, now friend and ally but never fully trusted. For Albia, towering amid the North Atlant wilderness, had once been not only a feared enemy whose legend stalked the age of strife, but once was also a true rival for control of the destiny of mankind. By taking its brightest and best into the legions and the other growing imperial organisations marked for war amid the stars, the Emperor ensured they could never threaten unification from within. Secondly, it subsumed into the Emperor's forces all the martial traditions and bloodlines that had for centuries held much of Terra under their cruel grasp, and eventually overcome the Pan-Pacific Empire under the rule of the unspeakable king. Such a breed of relentless warlords and soldier scientists was a valuable resource that the Emperor was loath to waste. The warlord clans of Old Albia did not readily bend the knee to the Emperor. However, having by then finally thrown off the tyranny of the last descendants of the unspeakable king, they refused to have another master in that person's place. Instead, the Albians met the Thunder Warrior regiments with their own battalions of steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts and armoured Ironside soldiers. In battle after battle, the forces of Unification were held in check, although at a shattering cost for the Albians, who would not give in despite the onslaught. Admiring the martial temper and courage of the foe, the Emperor called a ceasefire and sought victory over the warlord clans by negotiation, knowing that to crush them by force alone would entail a grinding bloodbath that would only serve to decimate his own forces and gain him nothing but a handful of ashes as a prize of war. Thus it was that despite the contra-advice of his human counsellors and generals, for whom the warriors of Old Albia had held an almost superstitious fear born of generations, the Emperor pursued peace. Going before them, it is said, unarmed and clothed in white and crimson, the Emperor spoke to the warlords' parliament and laid before them his vision of a future mankind, reunited and descendant, of tyrants toppled and nightmares slain. He offered them glory among the stars, and most importantly, redemption for many hundreds of years of kinslaying and bloodshed. The warlords of Old Albia, to the shock of many, accepted. In doing so, the Albion clans became among the Unification's most zealous supporters, although still untrusted by many, lending them warriors and war machines to the Emperor's cause. And also in addition, secrets long kept were offered up to the Emperor's eyes alone. Most importantly, for the future of humanity, they sacrificed their sons to become the Space Marines, who I mentioned later became known as the Death Guard. As with all the Legiones Astartes, the First Legion was intended as a replacement for the Thunder Warrior Brigades, that unstable experiment which by the mid-years of the Unification Wars had run its course. The Thunder Warrior regiments had been the tool needed for their time, as unrefined and savage a weapon as could be needed to match the grim tyrants and debauched warlords of ancient terror. Yet in comparison to the Astartes, they were a rough breed, powerful to be sure, perhaps even individually more so than their new kin, but unable to quell their fury, to work in unison. They were a mob, a storm of fury and blades that rolled over its foes, whilst the Astartes were a true army and in their unity could withstand any onslaught. The First Legion would demonstrate the potential within them, for they were a true legion numbering nearly 10,000, whilst their kin were but a few hundred each, and they would be fielded at Samarkand and face 200,000 gene-forged Udug Hull, the elite slave soldiers of the King of Akkad. The Udug Hull, whose blood was poison and whose strength was greater than 10 unenhanced warriors, were the terror of the upper Asiatic basin, and a foe that had so far resisted the advance of the Emperor's armies. So far. 10 hours after battle was joined, Samarkand was in ruins, the Udug Hull scattered and broken, and the great king of Akkad's head, a trophy on the belt of the newly appointed Grand Master of the First Legion. This warrior, Hector Thrain, was lauded by the princes of Terra for his victory and granted the title Sinistra of the Emperor, the left hand of the warlord of Terra, his most fearsome instrument of conquest. By order of the Emperor, the First Legion left no stone upon stone, and almost every record of the terrors encountered in that battle was destroyed. In the wake of the victory, the rate of recruitment and processing of the new legions was accelerated, their potential proven in triumph, and the First Legion gained a dark renown among the ranks of the armies of Unity. They had walked into the mouth of hell, and not only had they returned, but they had left hell, that place behind them, shattered in their passage. This first victory was to set the pattern of the First Legion's battles during the Battle for Old Earth and the Sol System, pitting them against the most horrific of foes, with only one objective: to eradicate them utterly, completely. From Fortress 31 in the Thulian wastes of ancient terror, to the Battle of Carnarchon amid the cryovolcanic mountains of Sedna, the First Legion would meet the worst threats that faced the armies of Unity and lay them low. So horrific were many of the threats they faced, Xenos terrors beyond the pale of sanity, and psychic phenomena that threatened to tear reality asunder, that little more than the battle honours remain as evidence of what happened. The details are erased even from the data stacks of the Emperor's library. To prosecute these impossible battles, the Emperor would grant them access to the armoury vaults of the Imperial Palace, to every forbidden weapon entombed within, and they would be the only legion trusted to wield the worst of mankind's creations freely. The orders of Grandmaster Hector Thrain would see the obliteration of the warped cities of Kadun and Mole in the eastern reaches of ancient terror, and the deployment of gene-phage munitions to purge, clean, a crave infestation also on Terra. These were victories that left an indelible stain on both the course of the war and the identity of the warriors who prosecuted them, forging Thrain's reputation as a ruthless and prideful warlord. Among the armies of Unification, the First Legion had become synonymous with death, for where they walked it seemed the Pale Rider followed. This had inevitably spawned many long-held superstitions regarding the reclusive warriors of the First. They were treated with an awe that sat somewhere between respect and terror by those who served alongside them, for it was said that to offend them was to bring the scrutiny of their patron, Death himself, upon the offender. Among the host gathered by the emperor, they were not heroes, but rather a breed of monster made loyal by the will of their master. They were not to be lauded for their bravery, but rather placated to assuage their wrath. Despite the dictates of the imperial truth, the common soldiery of the imperial armies often set small wards and charms at the edges of their camps when the First Legion arrived to avert the ill luck that many felt followed the Emperor's firstborn legion. Such superstition was not without cause, for of those imperial formations attached to support the First Legion in combat, most came to bloody ends. Some were savaged by the monsters that the newly dubbed Angels of Death had come to slay, and others would simply vanish, purported to have been silenced by the First Legion themselves, lest word of some dread enemy returned to the camps. The warriors of the First Legion, ever of pragmatic mind, soon began to assume the guise in which they had been cast, adopting the skeletal icon of death as their own and adorning their armour with funerary symbols. This self-imposed exile from the camaraderie of the Emperor's lesser servants was a point of pride amongst the First Legion. It was a sacrifice made to protect the mortal army from the terrors only the First Legion were fit to bear, though to some of those they fought beside, most especially the other Astartes, it seems more vainglory and arrogance than humble sacrifice. The masters of the first showed no interest in such slights, content to remain wreathed in malign rumour as they fought the battles that could never be lauded lest they break the minds of those who bore witness to the battle honours. For while the younger legions were granted the lesser honour of standing triumphant at the mundane victories of conquest, the first will be awarded the greater honour of acting as the Emperor's left hand, a brutal efficiency, a weapon of grim aspect, hidden behind the bright pageantry of the Imperial Army. Let me know your thoughts on this part of the Unification Wars with a comment below, and if you like this 40k video I did, why not try this one?